Hello and welcome to the Happy Hours with I am Eileen Cook. Today is Wednesday, April 3rd, and it is bright and early in the morning. So first off, I wanted to touch base. I know there are a couple people who were at Creative Inc. This past weekend, and I'm curious if anyone had any big takeaways that they really wanted to highlight, something that they was their big couldn't miss. And for Bonnie, who's dashing in from breakfast, we're doing any Creative Inc. takeaways that you really wanted to highlight. It looks like Tony's looking for one.
I'm just looking through my notes, yeah.
If people didn't go, Creative Inc. is held every year at this time. It is in Burnaby. It is actually, I can't remember the name of the hotel, but I think it's the Delta that's right there. And it is a nice opportunity to have a sort of a writing workshop. It is quite inexpensive. It's $80, I think, for the 3 days. So it's darn inexpensive. It's a little bit, what I would say, I don't want to say less professional than Surrey, but the speakers often, like, it's an opportunity for people who haven't spoken before to get some practice. So sometimes the speakers are sort of working on that thing, but it is a good opportunity to do that. I did both West Coast Crime and Creative Inc. at the same time. So I was dashing back and forth to both. Yeah, which I wouldn't necessarily, don't double book yourself for conferences. That's my advice to you. But what I did find is Lisa Voisin, who's also a member of the Academy, she and I did a workshop together on 7 habits for highly effective writers. And we are going to do that as a special session for our group here at the Creative Academy. So we will recreate it and do that on a Tuesday night coming up here, probably sometime later in April, and post our handout and all of that. So Bonnie, Jacoby, or Tony, either of you have a big takeaway you wanted to share?
Well, there was one session that was actually really interesting. It was a guy named Dwayne Clayton, who was a police officer, an EMT, I think, in Kelowna, and he did a whole thing about blood, guts, and gory was kind of whatever the title, and he actually went through, physically what happens, and he had pictures that I had a couple of them. I had to kind of look away on what happens with a knife attack or a bullet attack, or the mechanisms of injury, or if you've got I made a note is that if a guy's coming at you with a knife, you need a minimum of 21 feet to be able to pull your gun and shoot him, right? So he was actually going through a lot of the physical things, a bit like what Tyner does, right? But it was good. It was talked about what happens when you're, if you've got an artery cut and your blood pressure drops, which means your heart keeps pumping because your blood pressure's dropped, and how long it takes you to die and things like that. But so that was from a thriller point of view. That was pretty interesting. John Maven did a thing about dialogue, and that was actually pretty good. And talked about, and I think, most of us have been doing this for a while. It was good kind of refresher. Dialogue is not conversation. It's kind of the illusion of transcribed speech, right? Because in a book, people don't talk like in a book, right? And talked about page density, and so within dialogue, enough sort of white space so it looks like it's going quicker than it actually is. I'm trying to think what else.
I think often those talks on things like dialogue are those good reminders. So, sometimes you'll hear something where you're like, my God, I've never heard that before. But quite often what you're hearing is just that thing like, right, I need to look at that again, or there's kind of a fresh take on it, which I think is really useful.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else who was at Creative Inc. want to share their wisdom? Tracy.
Yeah, so kind of from a very first, like, new writer, first time at like a big festival like that, I cannot stress anything how welcoming and inviting and open it was as someone to come and go, oh my gosh, there's all these people who've been here for years, but I didn't feel like the odd man out. And it was also my first blue pencil. It was nice to go with an editor and a writer, and I got some great feedback. So I got to see my story read by someone who's kind of out there. So that's a really good experience. And I highly recommend it, no matter how afraid you are to have someone read your story in front of you. I recommend doing it because it was very helpful for me. I also like quickly the amount of workshop on short stories as a person who started writing novels and novellas. I kind of found myself more comfortable writing short stories and getting all the tips that are unique to short stories because they are a different pace, different character development. Like everything has to happen a little quicker and tighter. So it was interesting how to fine tune that stuff to make it flow and to get into it a lot quicker. So you're not spending half of your story just creating atmosphere.
So two things on that. So first off, there is an interview with Mary Robinette Kowal, who's from Writing Excuses on the Creative Academy. And she's talking about short stories. So that might be something that you find interesting. And I'm also just want to highlight for everyone, I think it is that good reminder. Most of us are introverts. Like most of us are much more comfortable talking to our imaginary friends than we are to real people. So I'm going to give a tip of the hat to Tracy for going, first of all, because I think even just going to a conference the first time feels really overwhelming, and it feels like absolutely everybody else there is their like 15th time, and they all are like, hey, and they're greeting someone that they know. So it can feel really intimidating. And the people who get the most out of it are the people who push themselves out of that comfort zone. So you start up a conversation with someone, if you overhear them talking about something that's interesting to you, that you take advantage of something like a blue pencil session with someone, that you raise your hand and ask a question in a session. One, you get to meet a great group of people, hopefully. And two, it's just that feeling of connecting, right? And I think that we forget so often that writing is solitary, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
Leslie, I love that idea. I don't know if people see in the chat window, but she's writing a piece called Your First Writing Conference, an Introvert Survival Guide. Yeah, I think one of my big tips that I tell people when they go to the Surrey conference all the time is that one of the best things to ask anybody is, so what is it that you write? Because it's an automatic conversation starter, because people are always sort of interested, and it gives you a place to jump off from, and it's something that we all have in common. So that is definitely a big one, and pushing yourself is huge. Anyone else have any advice for Leslie that they would share for going to conferences? Yeah, prepare yourself. Good point. People will ask that. Yeah, I think if you're at all financially able to, if you have a room at the conference venue, that is such a lovely thing to be able to go back and just sort of have some moments. I think Kevin's goal is a good one, to sort of set up that you're going to meet a certain number of people at the conference, or to push yourself to do that. And I would actually build on that to say, kind of decide what it is your goal that you're trying to get from the conference. So, is it there's a particular, like you really want to work on dialogue, or you really want to meet new people, or you really want to learn some more things about publishing, but sort of set it out what your target is. And Bonnie, the question is, what advice would you give to someone who's going to a writer's conference? And you just went to the Jewish Writers Festival, so I'm curious if you had any tips from that. I think it's just, really useful to have some targets, but to also leave yourself open to the fact that you may have a set goal that you're trying to do, but you may have a wonderful serendipity thing that happens as a result when you didn't plan it. Anyone else, conference advice or takeaways from Creative Inc. that you wanted to share with anyone? I should feel like I should have Jeopardy music.
I think most of us are typing it.
Typing advice is also good. I will take that in the thing.
Drink lots of water.
Yeah.
Drink lots of water. Yeah, that's a good
Bring a
dress in
backpack.
layers. Yeah, bring snacks. an extrovert. Target her, get her. I'm oddly extroverted in short periods of time, but generally introverted. So people always think I'm an extrovert, but I'm actually not. It's a big fat lie. So I think it's knowing what works for you and sort of building towards that. So if you're going to need some downtime, have that. Oh, I like ambivert. I'm totally going to steal that, Kirsten. I may or may not give you credit. That's how that's going to depend. So I'm going to have people put in a chat window if you have any specific questions that you'd like me to answer today, and I will take those on. But I did have a question that got emailed to me that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which got bumped a couple times, so I'm going to make sure I tackle it today, which is, what is it the heck that agents do? So where this came up is Lily asked me a question where she was saying she thought that an agent would hire an editor for you to go through your manuscript. And that's not necessarily something that happens. So I thought it would be useful just to spend a few minutes on this. I have worked with an agent since 2006. So I'm speaking from my own experience. And then I actually did just happen to have a call to my agent this past week because we have some exciting things going on. And so I took a moment to sort of double check with her to make sure I wasn't missing anything in general. So I did get a little bit of feedback from Barbara as well. So the biggest thing to understand is that for most writers who are in sort of the aspiring stage or sort of the pre-publication stage, is they want to know why agents don't get back more quickly on queries, which is the great scandal of all of that. And that is to remember, as Bonnie's doing it, why? That agents, the query pile and the slush pile for them is the smallest part of what it is that they are doing. So when you are seeking an agent, it feels like it's the biggest thing that they are doing, which is standing in the way of what you want. But for them, going through the query pile is the smallest part of what they're doing, because the vast majority, 95+% of what they're spending their time on is their existing clients. So that's what they're working on. So what are they doing? So I sort of talked in terms of what is sort of non-negotiable and then moving into what is sort of more negotiable, which is some agents do it and some agents don't. So the first and the most primary thing that an agent's job is to sell your work. So their job is to get your work out there, to sell it, and to get you hopefully the best deal for that. And my agent really stressed the best deal, which is not always the most money. Money is certainly a big part of it, but it is not the only thing that they are doing. So they may be trying to balance getting you more of a marketing push. They may be trying to balance trying to get you, maybe a multi-book deal versus a single book deal for more money, depending on kind of what's happening. So that's something you'd be talking about with your agent about what kind of the goal is. But selling your work is the first and most important thing. And sort of secondly to that is negotiating contracts. So it did come up at Creative Inc. I was moderating a panel on how to get an agent, and we had an agent on that panel, and she was really talking about contracts being something that for a lot of people are really intimidating. And I think that's two parts. One is, as writers, we are woefully likely to undersell ourselves. We're just so happy that anyone wants our work, that we're like, you want to give me $1 for world rights forever? That sounds great. Like, I'll take it, which is actually not great at all. So you want an agent who's might be someone who can sort of get in there and negotiate that deal for you. They're also familiar with publishing contracts, so they know what they're looking for, and they can do that. For people who ask, do you have to have an agent? The answer is no. There are some people who are quite comfortable negotiating their own contracts. There are other people who hire lawyers to look through their contracts. Certainly a very viable option. As the agent pointed out in the panel at Creative Inc., if you are going to hire a lawyer, don't hire Uncle Joe, who is a real estate lawyer, because that is not necessarily useful, because publishing contracts are a strange bird, and you want someone who's familiar with the terms that are in that contract. So what you'd be looking for is an entertainment lawyer. Number 3 on the list of things that people are doing for you is they're most likely assisting with subrights. So subrights are things like film and TV deals, audiobook deals, foreign rights deals. Most agents have some kind of subrights agent that they work for. So for example, my agent, Barbara Powell's at Eileen Goodman, Heather Barbaro, I always pronounce her name wrong, there is their foreign rights person. That is all that she does. So for example, she is right now at the Bologna Book Fair promoting all of the Eileen Goodman clients. So all of the agents within Eileen Goodman agency, it's her job to try and sell our work in the foreign markets. And that is something that Barbara sort of overlooks for me and takes care of. So that's what she's looking for. The next few things that I'm going to mention, it depends on the agent. So when you're in the query phase and you're talking to agents about whether or not they're a good fit for you and all those kinds of things, some agents offer editorial services. So they are reading your manuscript before it goes out and they are offering you notes on that manuscript. Not all agents do that. Not all writers want their agents to do that. Some writers feel really strongly they don't want their agent to have a hand in it. My agent is pretty sort of 50-50. So now that I have an established relationship with my editor, she's much more likely to say, I'll take a look at that if you want me to, or you can send it directly on to Amelia. So sometimes I will be sending that. But when we first started working together, she definitely read absolutely everything that went through my hands and then went out. If they're going to assist with editorial, it's useful to sort of talk about what that's going to look like. So are they going to give you line notes, or are they just going to give you big picture notes? And that can be sort of useful to talk about. The next thing is that agents may assist with sort of big picture career planning. So I meet with my agent twice a year on the phone, unfortunately, although sometimes if possible in person if we can manage it, where we're actually talking about career planning. So what is happening with my career? How are my sales going? What's happening with marketing? What am I doing outside of writing? So like she knows all about the Creative Academy and where I'm spending my time. And we're kind of brainstorming, where is it that I want to go? What is it that I want to accomplish? And anything she thinks I should be keeping an eye on or paying attention to. Again, some agents do that. Some agents do not do that. So again, that might be something that you're talking about when you are talking with an agent, is whether or not they're going to do that. And lastly, on things that they do, my agent as well does assist with brainstorming, and quite a few of them do. So I typically will email her when I have an idea and be like, I have an idea for my next book, and we get on the phone and we sort of go back and forth and we're talking about that idea. And I find that really helpful in that very early stage, because she is seeing so many different parts of that process from different writers and from different publishers. So she's very good at sometimes helping me make a book a little bit larger or more inclusive. So that is stuff that she is doing. When they're selling your work, so I just broke down into different things. For them to sell your work, they may be suggesting changes. They're researching the market, so they're looking at what publishing houses are looking for and where it might be a good fit. They're choosing who to pitch to. So this is definitely one of the reasons. So sometimes people say, well, I don't think I need an agent because I know I definitely want my book to go to Tor, and Tor is going to be at the Surrey Writers Conference, so I'll just pitch them directly. But the challenge is with trying to meet an editor at a conference is the publishing house isn't sending their entire editorial board. They're sending one particular editor who may or may not be a good fit for your work. Whereas an agent is hopefully, they're at all sorts of various kind of schmoozy things. And so they're often having discussions about, oh, you know what I'm really looking for is, you know, time travel, paranormal story, blah, blah, blah. And they can be like, I know exactly who to send that to. Just as much as you hated writing the query, your agent actually has to do a pitch letter. So they are doing a query as well. So they are actually sending out to various editors or agents. Again, it's usually an email. Sometimes they'll do a two-pronged attack. So they will call the editor ahead of time and say, I'm going to be sending you over something I really want you to take a look at. But they are doing basically the same thing. They are sending over a query to try and entice the editor. They are then sending your book out, obviously, to various editors and following up to see what's happening. Once you have a contract offer, it's their job to try and get you the best deal possible, which includes things like money, marketing, a one-book deal versus multiple book deals, what kind of in-house support you can count on. They're looking at what sort of rights will be included in the contract. So is the publisher retaining audiobook rights, or are you getting foreign rights or not? They're negotiating due dates. So that's usually something that they're talking with you about. In many cases, when it's your first book, you've already finished the book. That's what they sent out to the editor. But after that, what is often happening is that you are writing on what's called proposal. So I will tell my editor, I have a great idea for a book. Hopefully she says yes. She offers me money. My agent negotiates that. And a part of that contract is a due date about when I have to have that book due. If you have multiple things going, so I have had times where I was doing some work for hire for HarperCollins at the same time I was writing my own books for Simon Schuster. So she's helping me think through, like, do you really want to have this due 2 weeks after your other book was due? Answer, no. So she's sort of helping me think through some of those kinds of things. And they're also looking at what your option agreement is, which is sort of what is your next book up, and trying to sort of do that. So that is what they are doing. Is there any questions about what an agent can do for you or not do for you? Not seeing any. Okay.
It's just hard to get an agent, I found.
Yes.
Right.
Very hard to get an agent.
It seemed it was much harder. It's been much harder than I expected it would. And part of it may be my chosen protagonist, but yeah, it was definitely a challenge.
Well, and I've talked to people. I know I've given you this example before, Tony. So sorry repeating myself to you, but for the other people in the crowd, just think of how many books that you've read in the past year, and that you probably really liked. Like when you finish them, you're like, that was a really good book. And then think about how of that number, how many did you actually pick up the phone and call a friend and say, oh my God, you have to buy this book. It's so good. You have to read it. And that's a much, much smaller range. And that actually what the agent has to do is they have to convince someone to buy the book, and not for $14.95 or $22.95 or $7.95, but for like $10,000 or $100,000 or, $500,000. Let's dream big, right? So you're asking for a big thing. And on top of that, they also have to think that they can sell it, because for the agent, they make no money unless they can sell the book. And you're also competing what else may be on their list. So if they have a whole schwack of thriller writers, they might be like, you know what, I'm looking for a different kind of, like I'm looking for a thriller writer who's doing psychological drama, not action-paced spy thrillers, because I already have 3 spy thriller people. And it's sometimes really hard to know who those people are. So finding an agent is definitely a challenge. All right. If there are no other agent questions, I'm going to hit the other 2 questions that we have in our chat window. So Bonnie with an I, Goldberg, is attempting to write a different way than you're used to. So you're doing Camp Nano. So what are you doing differently, Bonnie? So how does this compare to how you usually write? Let's hear that first.
So I write extremely slowly, right? I am really thinking things through and trying to get a turn of phrase and, make it beautiful and make it powerful, because that inspires me and helps me to see what's going to happen next sometimes. And honestly, I've just done it for 2 days, right? I mean, this is my first time trying anything like this. And I feel, and to be fair, to be completely transparent, these 2 days I've been working off the 10 pages that, I've been writing, sort of rewriting the 10 pages that I had of this manuscript that I started in like 2004. But I can see that this is going to be like, the only way I can think about doing this is to make it like a, like, what do you call that? I can't remember what you call it anymore. Like not automatic writing, but I feel like the only way I can do this is to just sort of say go, and just not care what I write at all. And that is so counterintuitive to anything that I've ever done that wasn't, that kind of free writing. So I'm feeling like I thought there'd be like a difference maybe between free writing and something in the middle from that to my sort of painstaking trying to get trying to get rhythm and pacing and language and sensuality and all that kind of stuff into my prose. So I just wanted to hear from other people, like, how do they do this and what do they do? And just I'm feeling worried and scared, but I'm doing this on purpose because I've never done it before, and I feel like, if it's not useful, then I'll just know and I never have to do it again. But if it is useful, I'm not going to do it on my own. Like I think I'll just do this. So yeah, I could use the hive mind.
So I think, first off, I think it's great that you're doing it. So I think it's really useful. And often, again, when we talked earlier about things that we find useful at conferences, is I love hearing about other people's process. And I know I've told the story a million times where I heard Jennifer Cruzy speak, and she was going to do these vision boards and collages. And I was all like, yeah, I'm going to do that. And then I, didn't find it useful at all. But it was interesting to try it as a process. And I definitely became much more of an outliner by listening to other people talk about that. Like my initial books, I did all sort of seat of my pants. So I think trying something different is really useful. And I think the benefit of Nano is less sort of just free writing, as you talked about, or Marianne used the term sort of stream of consciousness, but it's around the idea, and Leslie sort of put it in here, about turning off your internal editor, which is that idea of, instead of workshopping a piece of writing and making sure like, okay, I've got it exactly how I want it before I go on to the next one, just sort of saying like, okay, I have the idea of where I want to go. I really struggle with doing Nano without having a bit of an outline, because otherwise I feel like I have no idea where I'm going, and that stresses me out. Other people are chiming. Go ahead.
I have a little bit of an outline because I thought there's just no way. But even just looking at it, going like, I don't know how I'm going to get from here to there, and when I have too much of an editor in my brain. What it feels like is I'm just like, I don't even know what to write next, and that's why it feels like it's going to be more like free writing, because I really don't know what's going to happen next, or how to get my characters from one place to another. And I think a lot of the reason I'm slow is I'm doing that processing while I'm writing. But it does mean that it takes forever for things to get done.
And it'll be interesting actually to see if you end up someplace that you never would have thought of by the process of just pushing through. I think
What
Tracy.
do other people do? What do you all do?
Tracy had a comment.
Yeah, so I actually started writing 6 years ago through Nano. Nano was like my first official writing thing I did. I did the November 30 days, 50,000 words. And I've done it for 6 years and succeeded for 4, so not bad, not a bad ratio. I'm a bit of a half between the two. So I do like to outline, but I'm also a bit of a pantser. And Nano does appeal to that pantser side of you. You just kind of fly. Some people call it word vomit. You literally just throw stuff on the paper and expect that it's not going to be like 100%. So like people said, the editor side really just, honestly, you have to go tell it to take a nice vacation in Hawaii. And your writer side just throws all the ideas out on the paper, because you can fiddle with stuff after. And Denise Jayden, I don't know if anyone else here knows Denise Jayden. She's from Vancouver area. I can't remember exactly where. She wrote a book called Fast Fiction, I believe, because her very first book she published was through a Nano competition. And so she wrote a little book on how her process was to go through it. So it was very interesting to read that and see, what ideas she gave you to kind of plan ahead if you really want to plan, but also how to work it, go day by day, and what goals to have for day 1. What goal would you want to have on day 7? Because it will evolve throughout the 30 days.
Anyone else want to chime in with some advice? I see there's lots. I don't know if you're seeing the chat window there, Bonnie, but lots of people are putting some advice in there as well. Anyone else want to, like,
Sure.
Christy? Oh, we'll go Christy and then we'll go Tony.
Okay. Sorry, Tony. I superseded you. I take great comfort hearing this from Bonnie, because I totally write like you, Bonnie. And I must admit, I love your glasses as well.
Thank you.
But it is really hard to do it differently. And what I'm trying to do for myself is actually, because I'm a visual artist as well, and I tend to sometimes paint the same way over and over and over again. And I teach my kids, if you're not making mistakes, you're not working hard enough. And so I thought, oh, should I take my own advice, right? And and I tend to use kind of the same color, like blue, green, purple. So I have all these other like reds and oranges and yellows that are left in my paint box. So over the last few months, I thought, okay, that's it. I can only use those colors. And it's amazing what I've come up with. And I thought, wow, like just doing that one thing differently. And I also take great comfort from, I have a math prof in one of my art classes, teaches up at SFU. And I do love math myself, but there's that feeling in math that, well, there's only one way to go. But I challenged him the other day and I said, it's really interesting, because what about the uncertainty principle, right? And so what that principle states is that there can be no creativity without uncertainty. And so I give you that. And I do love it.
Thank you.
Take it away, Tony.
So a bunch of years ago at Surrey, I did a writing class with Bob, Jack Remick and Bob Ray, two guys from Seattle, and they heavily leveraged Natalie Goldberg's timed writing. And so what I'm using in Nano, and when I first did Nano, it kind of blew my head off, because it's like I took forever, and I was doing outlines and I was doing character profiles, and I threw all that out, and I basically did the seat of my pants. But the thing when I'm doing it is I start with a start line, which is today I'm writing about, and I describe what I'm writing, what I think I need to write. And then what happens is that it starts to go into dialogue or something, into an actual narrative. And then if I get stuck, I go, well, today I'm writing about, and I repeat it. And so I'll have narrative, at the end of the day, I'll have, 3,000 words of maybe half the stuff is good, but I don't go back and edit. I just keep going. And then the next day I start off, well, my character is this and this and this needs to happen. And I just go and I type as fast as I can. I don't spell check. I don't, edit. So I don't cross out if you're doing it by hand. And that seems to, surprisingly, it seems to, and I've got it, and my last Nano I had a rough outline where I was going. So I had this sort of direction where I was going. But yeah, I was quite surprised at what happened. And I didn't worry about the word choice, and I just, again, sort of word vomited on the page.
Tony, do you read what you've written the day before, or do you just? No, I just keep going. It's to get to the word count, and notes to myself is part of the word count. I count everything. I count in fuck, shit. I hate this doing thing. What am I doing this for? And then and then the woman threw the ball through the window, or whatever happens. So that just, yeah, I don't go back and read. I just kind of keep in my mind. I says, oh yeah, she needs to walk into that room now, and then the cleanup. After it's done, the cleanup, I've got to go through and then make it look like I knew where I was going all along.
Just delete all those F words.
Yeah. Sort to replace.
Yeah, and I think before I go to Leslie, I just wanted to add to that. Like, I think putting in notes to yourself is really useful, because you might just have a moment where you're working on one thing and you're like, oh, I wonder about this, or I'm going to have to figure out what I'm thinking for my own. Like, I have to figure out what kind of poison would work for that. And I just don't worry about it for the time. And I just make some notes to myself that I'm going to go back and worry about that later. But I have that kind of history. Leslie, you had a comment.
Yeah, but you stole it.
The poison?
So basically, that's what I did with this project I'm just working on now. And I just wrote, you need to do this, you need to fill this in. And so yesterday I went and I took those all, well, not even all of them, and I dropped my manuscript word count by 9,000 words. But I know where I'm going now. But at the time I didn't want to stop because that would just stop me. So I go, okay, we'll work on this, blah, blah, this is what I want to do. Then when I'm revising, I go back and read that, okay, and it just keeps you moving forward that way. So yeah, sad at the end though.
I'm curious for anyone's show of hands. One of the things that I really struggle with, which is why I think Nano is so great for me, is if I do what you're talking about, Bonnie, where I'm really, thinking very carefully about what I want to do, and I have done that as well, then I get really married to it. Whereas if it's been sloppier, I don't want to say sloppier, but more seated in my pants writing, and I'm just kind of like, then I'm very open to like, this may all change. And I don't feel as precious about cutting those words. But when I know that I've spent 2 weeks on a scene, if 3 months later I write another scene, I'll be like, well, but it has to fit with that earlier scene because that scene is now perfect, damn it. So I'm certainly not cutting those words. So then I will sometimes almost push to make whatever new thing I'm writing work with what I previously wrote. Whereas if I kind of push through, or, Tracy's comment in there, like just not doing it and just sort of going forward, or Kevin's note, like only reading the past few paragraphs to remember kind of where I was, then I will push forward. And I actually have come to love revising. I used to hate it. I used to be like, I'm done with that project, next project. But now I actually quite love, like once I have a draft, like now I feel like the fun really starts because I have something to work with. Kevin, you had a comment.
I was just going to add a point. Tony mentioned Natalie Goldberg's style of writing, which most people associate with journal writing and memoir writing, but I've worked with her for years and years. And quite often she'll pull the fiction people aside in a workshop and she'll say, okay, write a scene. Then say, okay, turn the page, write it again, same scene, write it a third time. And then go back and kind of highlight where you feel you've really grounded in those words. And then that starts becoming a more edited quantity. But it's a great way also just to warm up the brain and to start. It's a form of meditation that I think clears the mind and opens those creative aspects to you. If you can just take 10 minutes and freehand write, then go to your project.
I think there's also something really interesting around, and probably Don Moss, I can't remember who taught it to me, but he was talking about the importance of brainstorming. And, if you're thinking like, okay, I have a character, they're in a room, the bad guys are out front, they have to get out of this room. Okay, what can they do? Like the very first thing that comes to your mind might be like, okay, they're going to go out the window. And if you start writing, then you're married to that. But if you take a moment and you're like, okay, what are all the ways they could get out of this room? They could go out the window. They could go up through a ceiling tile. They could try and fit through a heating vent. They could try and do some kind of distraction to get the people away from the door. They could teleport. They could set off a bomb and go through, like you start, like, even though you may have some ridiculous ideas, you might somehow get yourself to something that's different and more unique. And I think too often we go with our first thing, which is also often the reader's first answer to something. So, just taking a moment before a character makes a decision and being like, what are all the different ways the character could tackle this? And it's, again, when we're writing, sometimes we just go with the very first thing that's in our head. But if we take a moment, and again, as Tony said, this would all count towards your word count, is be like, the character does this or this or this or this or this, and then pick one and keep going. But then you'll also have those other ideas in there, and you might, when you're going back, be like, it might be more fun if they had to use subterfuge to get out of the room. So rather than the going out the window and shimmying along the window ledge, I'm going to have them go and do something else. Any other tips for Bonnie? All right. So thank you. That was a good question, Bonnie. And we're going to check in with you to see how it's going.
Yeah, this was really helpful. Thank you, everybody.
I'll be very interested to see how it goes. So I want to go back. Kristen asked a question. Kristen, do you want to talk about sort of what made you want to ask the question? So you talked about sort of over workshopping. Oh, you're totally silent. No microphone for Kristen, which is weird because it shows that you have one. Try now.
Run down here, Kirsten, and ask the question.
Okay.
Oh.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, no, I had a story, and I'm doing this course, and as part of the course, we read each other's work, like critique, and they're new people I never met before. So they did it. There's 3 people, and then the instructor, and then I also had my own critique group read the pieces, just because I wanted to, I don't know, just kind of compare the advice. And when I turned in the piece the second time in the course, the instructor was like, "Oh, it's really over workshopped." And I thought, like, but I didn't take every piece of advice that they threw my way. I didn't disagree with what the story needed, you know, and so I kind of like worked it in. And then her comment was then that I was now over workshopped. And I like, where's the line between taking critiques and then like, you know, getting over workshop? Like, is there some sort of formula, like, oh, you should take, you know, 2 out of every 3 comments or something? Because I wasn't unhappy. I don't think I took I didn't change the piece completely. So I don't know, I was surprised by the comment, and I just, yeah, like, I know there was like, you know, trust your voice and all that, but I truly didn't have you know, the advice that I accepted, they were like the weak points of my story, and I felt it was that what they were suggesting was like more collaboration. So that was where it kind of came from.
So I'll be interested if other people want to chime in. So raise your hand if you have a thought on this. So I'm going to give you my first thought, which is a very dangerous thought to say as the person who is leading this group. But maybe the person leading the group was wrong. So one person's idea of over workshop might be someone else's opinion of it's exactly where it needs to be. So, you know, when you talk about taking feedback, I think we have a tendency to imbue some people with saying like, well, this person has more valuable feedback than another. And I say this as someone who teaches, where when you're in the front of the room, people assume that you obviously know what you're doing. But I actually don't always think that that's the case. And I may have a wrong view. I mean, I always think if there is someone who is an instructor or a workshop leader, like they probably got that because they had some kind of experience. So it is definitely worthwhile to listen to what they said, but don't confuse that with assuming that because they're the workshop leader, that they necessarily know what's right for your work. Bonnie, you had a thought.
Yeah, I find that some people use that term and mean it differently than you might be interpreting it. Sometimes over workshop can mean that you somehow lost the voice and the heart that you had before. And often that's as simple as word choice. So when you were editing and you were like making things tighter, you lost some of that voice. Other people look at it and they feel that it's, you know, flat might be the word because it's technically correct, but they aren't connected to it anymore. And honestly, I personally would say, what do you mean? Because over workshop could be over edited. It could be, oh, now it sucks. Like, you know, does it suck, or does it mean that no, they can't do anything with it? It's so marvelous. Like, what do they mean? So, I find that taking other people's feedback, you almost need sometimes one more step. You took their feedback, you implemented it, and now you're getting the feedback that something isn't quite right with it. And if you look at it again and say, well, how do I make this totally mine? And can I hear myself in it? And it just might be that one more step is needed to put yourself back into it now that you've accepted and implemented other people's suggestions. That's me.
Well, and I think that's a really valuable point around which I think we often don't do in so many things, not just with writing communication, but asking someone like, can you tell me what you mean by that? because we often use a lot of terms. So it might be useful. I certainly, when I use it, usually what I'm talking about is that loss of voice, where either one of two things has happened. Either that a piece feels totally wishy-washy, like it feels like it was a group write, like, you know, like I write one paragraph, then you write a paragraph, then I write a paragraph. And so it sort of feels like I can't tell who wrote this anymore, and it feels disconnected. It doesn't sound like that's what happened to yours, but it could be that sparkle. So what is it that made it sound like you? And is there a way to kind of get that back in there? And I would kind of echo Bonnie's things around thinking about word choice or how things look on the page. If you were more dialogue heavy, maybe you need to have more dialogue back in there. It might be, again, sometimes over-workshopped has to do with things are too technically correct. So I'll see it sometimes where people, they were using sentence fragments or, you know, I got to get going, and they changed it to I've got to get going. I had a line of dialogue where the copy, like it had something like, I ain't got no reason to do this anymore, right? And the copy editor's like, well, that would be a double negative. So this should read as, I do not have a reason to do this anymore. And it was like, okay, but that character would never say that. Like, the whole point is that they would say it wrong. And I want it to be wrong. So sometimes it can be a case that you've just gotten too correct with things. And so you want to kind of have it be a little bit rough, if that makes sense. Other people, anyone want to offer a piece of advice on over-workshopped?
Well, by not saying what that meant, you know, that it's like, if he had given you more, he or she given you more detail, more examples of what I meant by that, but saying, oh, that's, you know, do it again, but better, right? It's like, oh, that helps a lot.
It's not a very well understood term,
No.
Kristen, so
No.
obviously if we can't figure out what they meant, there's a lot of room for interpretation.
Right. Like, you know, if you've got one bit of advice I got from an editor a long time ago was that I was doing too much to and fro in a scene. The character would walk here and then do this, and they'd walk there and do this, and I needed to shorten it. It's like, okay, that's really good feedback, right? But yeah, over-workshopped is bullshit as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's incumbent on the instructor to be articulate, a writing instructor specifically, to be articulate and specific, concrete and detailed, and show, don't tell, when they give you a comment. So I would not spend another iota of energy trying to figure out what the person meant. And I would hold them accountable in a nice, respectful way for some concrete, show, don't tell, detailed explanation. That's what you're paying them for.
Talk about putting the pressure on,
Yeah.
Bonnie.
Yeah, and we're going to go there with you.
Yeah.
Well, I've been a
muscle
writing
behind
instructor too, so I mean, I've been called on the carpet, and I think that's you know, writing instructors can also get really lazy, not necessarily on purpose, and just use jargon and generalities while they're busy telling students to completely not do that thing. And we as writing instructors need to role model that. That's all. I mean,
well, and I think it's, you know, it's also a thing like, which is kind of a different version of what you're asking, Kirsten, but sometimes, you know, people can be in a critique group for a long period of time, and you do have a shorthand that has developed, and you kind of know what you mean by certain things, and then you can change groups. So like anyone who ever, like Christy's going to have a little twitch at this moment. Like in my SFU group, I use the term microcut all the time. So I'll say things like, do you need to say, I stand up? Like, is it enough to just to say I stood or I stand? Like, maybe you don't need the up, and it's a small little world that you can take out, and you can, you know, just kind of condense things in that way. So I'll use the term microcut, and then I have to catch myself if I'm talking to someone that I haven't worked with before. Like, what is it that I mean by that? And what I mean is taking out words that aren't necessarily wrong, but that your writing might be tighter and more concise if you trimmed them out. So I think, yeah, pushing the writing instructor to be a little bit more clear about what it is that they're talking about can be helpful. And I think you're also going to butt up, as you do with any sort of critique group, with everybody has their own particular thing that they bump on. So I had to laugh because Kevin mentioned when people have in their manuscript a string of questions. So a character is asking themselves, what did Kirsten mean by that feedback? Did she mean I wasn't a good writer? Did she mean that the story wasn't interesting? Maybe she didn't want me in the critique group at all and wants me to leave. So if I see a big string of questions, I will go back to the writer and say, can you make some of these statements? And where that comes from is getting thumped on the head by my own editor by that. So now it's one of those things that I notice in my own writing, because I do it quite a bit, is I have characters think in these long stream of questions. And my editor pointed out to me, like, whenever you have a lot of questions in a row, to some degree, the reader's wanting those answered. So if you change some of them to statements, even like, what did Kristen mean? It felt like she didn't want me in the group anymore. Like, you're still getting the same feel, but it feels like you've kind of already answered. And yes, Natasha, I am thumping right on back. So there are certain things that will get sort of drilled into you as a writer that you then are much more cognizant and noticing with other people. So you will notice that you do it, and so you're wanting them to do it. So I do find that, you know, when you're working with a critique group, there are certain people that highlight and bump on certain stuff because it's something that they're working on, so they're highlighting it. So that can be sort of useful. And I don't trust Bonnie and Leslie because I feel like they're laughing at each other. They're on similar couches, and they're doing stuff with their mics off, and they're talking about us. Quite certain about it. Yeah, I don't trust them. I don't trust them at all. I think, you know, the other thing, which, you know, is kind of something that you alluded to, Kirsten, but isn't the same in your situation, which is, I think, harder when you are a new writer, is when you get feedback, you feel like you have to incorporate every part of that feedback. And of course you don't. Like, you have to take a moment and sort of think about, like, is this what I'm really trying to accomplish in my story? And one of the useful things is to sometimes ask back, not only just like, what did you mean by over-workshopped, is, you know, can you tell me what bothered you about that situation? So someone might change a scene and be like, well, I think you should be doing something like this. But if you ask them, they might come back and say, well, I just felt like there was too much introspection, to steal from, again, the chat window. So, okay, like, I don't want to change it in this way, but I now realize maybe it's a little bit too much introspection and I'm going to change it in this other way. So sometimes trying to get at what they felt was the problem versus how they might solve it. And that's often just sometimes a feedback thing. Some people give feedback by saying, you know, this isn't working, I didn't like your character. And other people will give you specific tips on what they think would make the character more likable. Neither is wrong. Sometimes I love the suggestion because it's exactly what I do want to do. But sometimes we bump on the suggestion because we're like, I don't want to take that suggestion. And I just want to figure out what's going on. And Marianne's putting it much better than I did, which is symptom versus diagnosis versus prescription. So kind of thinking about what that is, and she stole it, so she's not even taking credit. It's from Mary Robinette, which is useful, which is there something that, like, this just makes me feel this way, so I'm not sure that it's working, versus I think what's not working is that, you know, you have too many point of view changes versus you need to make this first person point of view. All of those can be useful at different times, but not sometimes. You can get stuck on one versus another. Any other thoughts on feedback, critiques? Let's all just give a little bit of sparkle jazz hands for Mary Robinette, who was nominated for Hugo for Calculating Stars, which is all sorts of awesome. Yeah, so if you haven't read Calculating Stars, I would tell you to give it a peek. It's well worth it. All right, we are almost out of time, but we have a couple minutes. Does anyone else have any last minute, not a complicated question to solve?
I have a very quick question.
Sure.
How much? We're echoing. Sorry. How much of an info dump is too much? Is a paragraph too much?
So how much info dump is too much?
Just a little paragraph.
So
Sorry.
what I'm going to say is part of that's going to depend on the reader and also on the tone of the book. It was very interesting. I was teaching at SFU last night, and one person had this info dump, and I did not like it. And for me, it pulled me completely out of the story. Someone else, it was one of their favorite parts because they felt like it suddenly put all this sort of context into things. So we had a throwdown argument where I was like, I'm the mentor, damn it, what I say goes. So I will be the arbiter of how much info dump is too much info dump. One of the things I would say is, in general, of course, you want to not have it. And what you're trying to do is to see if you can thread it through. So that's the braiding that Marianne is talking about. Or ask yourself, are you info dumping as almost an omniscient third-person narrator? So for example, if I'm talking about, I'm in a teen's perspective, and we walk into the Tower of London. And I want the reader to have some information about the tower. And I say something like, Eileen walked into the room and looked around. The Tower of London had been built originally by William the Conqueror in 1242, starting with the White Tower, but it had been around for a little while, blah, 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 blah. And now back to the story. It feels like very much like the reader is aware that it is an info dump. If I have it, and please excuse me because this is clunky, but Eileen walked into the Tower of London and looked around. Holy shit, this place was old. The guy told him it had been built in 1299. She can't even fathom 1299. How many great grandparents would that have to be? And it was a hodgepodge of stuff. You could tell it was built at all different time periods. So all of a sudden you're getting the info dump, but you're getting it from my perspective. And oftentimes what you'll find is the reader doesn't necessarily have the awareness that they've just been info dumped on. So you can sort of do that in there, or piece it apart where you have like a little bit of information and then some dialogue, having info come through dialogue. If you can avoid the like, that's a fascinating story, Kevin. Were you aware that the Tower of London was built in 1299? Well, no, I wasn't. Tell me more, Eileen. Well, I'm glad. So that will sort of go back and forth. But if you can sort of weave it in, like, Eileen, hey, the tower was built in 1299. You didn't know that, Kevin shot back. You just read that off a plaque. So you can kind of, again, sort of stream that in. I always just want to give people the hesitation, and we use it, which is so true. You want to show, not tell. But there are times when telling actually does make sense, where you can really summarize a lot of information with a short tell that would be pages of dialogue to try and get it all into the showing. So that's just my free permission to say you can break that rule. You just want to more often than not break it. Does that help, Leslie? Thumbs up. All right. I'm just reading Marianne's comment. Yeah. So you're kind of trying to summarize and not overly get into certain things, but at the same time, give people what they want to know. So anytime I think you can make it interesting or filter through the character's point of view, you just add a texture. So if you're doing a setting, it's not just what this room looks like, but what this room looks like to me. So do I feel in place in this space, or do I feel out of place? Am I in awe, or do I feel awkward? Those things will make a difference. And then also thinking in terms of tone. Is this a horror novel, or is this a light romantic comedy? And that will change the word choice. So you might describe it as the walls were painted a bone white, if you're trying to do it, in one way, or you might talk about a hospital white, or you might talk about cool and relaxed. So that kind of things can, again, just sort of add to tone. So that will happen a lot. All right, we are out of time. I want to thank everybody for bopping in. Next week, we're going to be changing it up because I'm flying back to see Mom and Dad. So office hours next week will be Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. And it is in all the calendars, but just so you heard it here first. All right, everybody, have a great day. Crystal Awe
Thank
has
you.
office hours later tonight, so feel free to check in on those. And until then, see you around.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Eileen.